"I'm sorry, but this is worse than anything you've seen so far," he said. "You mean my wife having fun with my boss, her boss, my lawyer, my friend, and at least a few other people at my workplace, and that's worse?" I asked, with a note of contempt in my voice. Norm didn't take it personally. He nodded. "Unfortunately," he began, but stopped. "I invited Damien here today because he is acting as your new attorney. So far, I've only shared snippets with him as he set things up, but given what today's report showed, I think he should be aware of our next steps. To be honest, I'm not entirely familiar with the conclusion of my marriage saga. When Candice returned from her conference, I was flying at 30,000 feet. In my ideal scenario, she'd burst through the door, thrilled to be home, expressing how much she missed me, expecting our usual routine of dinner waiting. But instead, she likely found a damning printout detailing her recent dalliances with my boss, her boss, a close friend, and, if I'm nitpicking, my lawyer. Beneath it, divorce papers, the prenup, and an eviction notice awaited her. I'd like to envision her devastated, but truthfully, I have no clue. Just a month ago, I was oblivious to her infidelity, unaware that my wife's affections were being shared among my employer, hers, and even my friends, betraying the vows we took. I'm Thomas Other, 27, slated to inherit a $70 million trust when I turn 32, the reason for my apparent contentment. Despite my privileged position, I wasn't idle. By day, I toiled as an accountant at Salmon & Sachs, a prestigious firm in Melbourne, Australia, supplementing my trust income with rental earnings and residing debt-free in my luxury penthouse. By now, you would guess that I grew up in a good family, and of course, you would be right. However, my parents always taught me to never look down on those who don't have the same education as us. I was an only child and lost both my parents and grandparents at the same time. They were aboard a private plane that went down over Europe during their vacation when I was 21 years old. I should have been on that trip, but I had university exams, so I became the sole surviving heir to the family fortune. That I was the heir to a huge fortune was no particular secret, but I never flaunted it. My parents bought me a beautiful penthouse apartment near the university, which was just a short walk from Salmon & Sachs when I graduated. So I lived very well for a few years and never complained. Back to my traitorous wife. I met Candice one night when my friends and I were walking around town. Candice was with a few girlfriends who were doing the same thing. We danced, I bought a few drinks, and she came back to my apartment and got into bed with me. When, after a drunken binge, we realized we liked each other, ironically, Candice that night was supporting one of her friends who found out her boyfriend was cheating on her. Over the next few months, Candice and I dated several times. When we decided to become exclusive, it was a foregone conclusion. I truly believed that in those early days, the fact that I had money never bothered Candice. Until recently, I'd always thought of her as balanced. Candice worked for one of the top marketing firms in town, and was making a decent salary herself. Looking back, I thought we had a wonderful married life. Being a young and well-to-do couple, we rarely ate at home. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, we both worked out at the gym, and on Saturdays, we partied in the city, enjoying gourmet meals, dancing at clubs, or laughing heartily at one of the local comedy clubs. Remembering how I had asked her to marry me, I shuddered at what I now knew. Of course, she said yes, and at the time, I considered myself the luckiest man in the world. Candice's looks were what most men would consider quite average. We had been married for 2 years and had started talking about a family when, in retrospect, things started to fall apart. Every few months, Candice had to leave for work, a conference, or some other reason. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, we never have any reason to doubt those we love, do we? More than once while my wife was away, I would relieve the stress of watching one of our home movies, but I never thought about the show that awaited me until one day it happened. My manager and partner at the firm I worked for, George Seaman, had just announced that he had to go away on a business trip for 3 weeks. This happened from time to time, but the duration of 3 weeks caught my attention. Candice also informed me this morning that she was to attend a 3-week conference next week. Of course, being the clueless husband that I am, I thought it was more idle curiosity than anything else, but it was one of our interns, 22-year-old blonde bombshell Iona from Germany, who brought me up to speed. "Hi Thomas," Iona said, entering my office after George's announcement. "Do you have a minute?" "Sure, Iona. Give me a second," I told her, saving a spreadsheet I was working on for one of our corporate clients. I turned to her and studied her for a while. Iona Brown was short in stature, but very pretty. She had long golden hair down to her waist, big expressive blue eyes, and the mien of a princess. She always wore conservative clothes but in a very professional manner that always said she was serious about her work. At the end of the next week, she would finish her work with us and move north, where she would tour Australia for the next year and then travel to Germany for another year to meet relatives. In the 3 months she worked for us, I had a few cups of coffee with her. She struck me as honest to a fault and never let anyone do wrong. One day, one of the junior accountants was under pressure to get a job done and tried to cut a few corners. Even though Iona was only a trainee, she told all, and the accountant had to eat crow for a month. So when I looked at Iona, and saw the solemn expression on her pretty face, I frowned, knowing the topic was going to be grim. "What's wrong, Iona? You look serious. Is everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated for a second, looking over her shoulder at everyone who was leaving the office. Then she frowned and looked at me again. "Thomas," Iona said very seriously, "I need to talk to you about something, but not here. Will you take me to lunch today?" I was curious as to what it might be. "No problem. Do you think DIY is good?" I asked, referring to the DIY sandwich store that was quite popular. For a few dollars, you could make a sandwich, wrap, or salad with anything you wanted. She nodded. "Yes, but please, the one on George, on the other side of William Street." Admittedly, I was curious, but I didn't think about traveling that far from the office until we were seated at the food table and she reached out for my hand. I looked at her, raising an eyebrow. I never thought Iona would hit on me, and she knew there was no way I would cheat on Candice. Seeing my raised eyebrow, Iona quickly removed her hand, blushing. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she said in her sweet, high-pitched tone. She had a slight German accent. "It's just that I know what I have to say will be very hard for you to hear." I wasn't thinking. "I'm sorry." I felt my stomach clench. I didn't know what this was about, but I suddenly realized that this was going to get me in trouble. I'd only met a look like Iona's once in my life. It was when my grandparents and parents hadn't returned from overseas. I swallowed. "It's okay, Iona," I replied with mock confidence, forgetting about my lunch on the table in front of me. "But I have to admit, I'm worried about you." "What's the matter?" Over the next 20 minutes, Iona told me how she had overheard George Simon talking to someone last week about how he couldn't wait to entertain everyone in 2 weeks. Iona blushed as she told me that he had agreed to meet with a group called Everyone for Coffee. She then stunned me by telling me that she had quietly followed him around, taking pictures of George and the other men hugging and kissing the mystery woman. Turning the phone around with a pained expression on her face, Iona showed me the photo, which turned out to be of the woman, my wife Candice. I nearly lost my unfinished lunch, and over the next few minutes, Iona told me how sorry she was. The only reason she recognized who the woman was because of the picture on my desk of Candice and me hugging each other on our wedding day. To say I was devastated is an understatement. I must have sat there almost comatose for several minutes before Iona reached out and touched my arm again. "Thomas," she said quietly, "can you hear me?" "Yeah, sorry, Iona. Thanks for not asking if I'm okay, but I'm not," I replied, and then sighed, wiggling my shoulders expressively. "I guess I should call a lawyer." Iona frowned. "I wouldn't," she said. I looked at her. "Why not? You always need a lawyer in a divorce. Why don't I start with one?" Iona fiddled with her phone for a minute and then turned it around, showing me another picture of the all-girl band. "Because next week, your lawyer is going with Mr. Simon, and your wife," I overheard. "There are 5 of them." "I'm sorry, Thomas," I groaned, leaning back in my chair. My chest felt tight, a sense of panic building, which I tried my best to contain. I looked at Jonah. "Why?" I asked, though I knew she wouldn't be able to answer. "From what I understand, it's because of the money," she said. "Money?" I asked quietly. "Yes," she replied, not quite sure how to inform me of these heartbreaking facts. "I don't know what they mean by that, but they said something about how the money should stay where it belongs, and that this is their way of doing it. You know those moments when you have a light bulb go off or you think, what the heck?" Well, I had both at the same time. "Iona, I need to throw up," I said suddenly. She nodded. "I understand." I shook my head, my jaw now set in determination despite the raging war of emotions playing out beneath the surface. "No, I mean I need to make myself vomit and send you back to the office, telling everyone I'm not well. Make sure Mary calls Candace and tells her I'm sick. Tell her I'm on my way to the doctor, and I'll figure something out after the visit." Mary was our office manager and served as our assistant bookkeeper. I stood up abruptly. Iona stood up with me. "Iona, I can't thank you enough for what you did," I told her, giving her a strained smile. "If you hadn't told me, I might have found myself in a situation that I think might be unwinnable. Can you tell this story to Mary? Will you be able to keep it between us?" Without a second's hesitation, Iona nodded her head, swearing quietly in German. "Of course. I'm sorry, Thomas. I hope you won't hold a grudge against me," she said. I smiled and held out my hand. "No, just the opposite. I owe you a great debt of gratitude. If you need a favor in the future, give me a call. Today, you have gained a friend for life." She smiled back. We shook hands and went our separate ways. I walked into the public restroom and tickled my tonsils, forcing myself to vomit. If I was going to take action, I had to do it realistically. I called my doctor but hung up at the last minute. While I was being restrained, I wasn't sure who was involved in this affair. I called another doctor and made my next appointment. I caught an Uber to get to the doctor and was seen just 5 minutes after my appointment time. The doctor, an Indian woman in her 40s, examined me, told me I most likely had a stomach ailment, prescribed some mild antibiotics, and gave me a prescription and a 3-day sick leave. Coming out of the operating room, I decided I needed to do something about it. I took my car and drove to a small hotel on the outskirts of town where I had always wanted to stay. It was a 15-minute walk from home, so I had never had to use it, but today it would be quite suitable for my purposes. I walked through the door and checked in. A few minutes after I lay down on the bed in my room, the phone rang. It was Candace. "Are you okay, babe?" she asked, with a note of concern in her voice. "Mary called and said you weren't feeling well." "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, faking it like I usually did when I was sick. I had just come from the doctor, and she said I probably had a stomach ailment. "I've settled in one place for a few days so I won't pass it on to you before you leave for the conference." On the phone, I felt her frown and hesitate briefly. I understand. Is there anything I can bring you? I was surprised. For a woman who'd slept with my boss, and who knows who else, she showed great concern. I thought about it for a moment. Yeah, could you bring me a couple of sets of clothes and toiletries? If I'm stuck here for a few days, I might as well get comfortable. You can take them to reception, and they'll leave them at my door, I told them. I wasn't feeling well, and they'll bring me chicken soup for dinner. Oh baby, Candace, I wish I hadn't left so I could keep an eye on you, I fake coughed. It's okay, Candace. I'll be better in a few days. We talked for a few more minutes, and I never would have believed anything was wrong if Iona hadn't shown me a picture of Candace and George in an embrace. As we hung up, I wondered if there was no other explanation. I had my laptop with me in my satchel, so I pulled it out, connected to the Wi-Fi in the guest house, and started searching for private investigators. I talked to 3 different agencies until I found someone willing to meet with me in the morning. I also called a new law firm, Bradman, Torrance, and Clark. I knew they were my attorney's main competitor and scheduled an appointment 2 hours late to meet with the investigator that night. I tossed and turned, slept for half an hour, and then woke up tossing and turning again. I was dozing off again when Candace called, checking to see how I was feeling and if I had gotten my clothes. There was concern in her voice, and I wondered again if she had really left me. Iona wouldn't lie, the pictures she'd shown me certainly didn't, but I thought that maybe she had a doppelganger that George Simon was sleeping with. In the morning, I informed the front desk of the B&B that I was leaving and would be back later today. I let them know I was on my way to a doctor's appointment in case my wife called and caught a car across town to get to Discreet Investigators, a private investigation firm. Inside, I didn't have to wait long as a very unassuming man came out and ushered me into a quiet office. I was surprised when he checked me for electronic bugs and made sure no one was dropping. He made me tell my story. The guy, that's what he called me, nodded when I told him what Iona had shared with me, showed him the pictures, and then asked what I wanted. We can offer a number of different services, but can you tell me what you need? Asked Norm. I thought for a moment. I would like my wife and my boss to be monitored, pictures, videos, and anything else you see fit. If something is going on, I want to make sure I know what it is before I take any action. I hesitated, and Norm noticed it right away. What? He asked, raising an eyebrow. I looked at the guy and decided to reassure myself. Look, I'm not sure I know what's going on, but my source says money is mentioned between my wife and my boss. I'm going to inherit a large trust fund in a few years, and I can't help but speculate if it has something to do with that. I need to know if I can trust you if you know there's a decent amount of money involved. Norm looked back at me for a moment, then smiled. Give me a minute, Mr. Other. He went out and returned a few minutes later with a pile of forms. I think we can help you get everything you want, Mr. Other. These forms are our confidentiality and financial forms. Our rates and legal terms are outlined here. I scanned the documents, noting that they were using the same lawyers I was about to visit. I signed the forms, and we shook hands. Norm told me that he would have people for both Candace and George by the end of the day. I informed him that I would cover all expenses, including travel if necessary, and headed off to my next meeting with the people who could be my new attorneys. Randwick Johnston had been our family attorney for many years. His grandfather had worked with my grandparents and parents when the trust was created. When his grandfather retired, Randwick, or Randy as we called him, took his place. In the years since, my family passed away. I never had any reason to doubt his integrity. I understood that handling my accounts was a feather in his cap of sorts. In fact, I had made recommendations to him several times over the years, and consequently, he had a small practice with several people at the firm. However, after yesterday's revelations, I wasn't going to wait for the mountain to fall on me. I was going to trigger the avalanche myself and hopefully not get caught up in its destruction. That's why Damien Torrance of Bradman, Torrance, and Clark ushered me into his office within 2 minutes of my arrival. Damien had been trying to get my business for years. A few years ago, Randy needed an extra pair of hands to help with an investment I wanted to make, and Damien had expressed interest, even offering to bring Randy in as a partner when he found out the details. So, Mr. Other, to what do we owe this rather unexpected visit and Mr. Johnston's absence? Asked Damien with that questioning look that only lawyers get. I have reason to believe that my wife, my boss, and my lawyer are conspiring against me, and I need to defend myself, I replied with a slight hint of concern in my voice. Lawyers are often portrayed as heartless and unfeeling bastards who run up huge bills and don't care about the people they represent. Damien Torrance was the epitome of this culture. He wore an expensive 3-piece suit, and sat in a lavish office designed to inspire fear. After hearing my statement, Damien stood up and turned to look out over the impressive view of Melbourne behind him. I heard him exhale, and for the next 20 minutes, I told my story leading up to this encounter. "You like a challenge, don't you, Mr. Other?" he said, turning to me with a shark grin on his face. "Look," he said, spreading his hands, "if you agree to turn your business over to our firm regardless of the outcome of the case with Mr. Johnston, I'll give you a total discount of 25% off our services for the next 3 years and even add 100 of my billable hours for free." To seal the deal. I stared at Damien for a minute, studying him. "Why?" I asked. "Thomas, may I call you Thomas?" I nodded. He nodded back and sat back down. "Keeping your account means a lot to us. It's not just the amount of money in your trust, it's also the business it brings in. You manage your money wisely, choose good investments, and I know that if I get your business, we'll have some more big clients coming in. If I give you an incentive to switch to us now while you're in trouble, it'll stop you from running around shopping and give us both a long-term benefit." I laughed. This guy was a great white shark, but he knew how to sell it. We spent the next hour ironing out the details, and then he asked his assistant to take me to another room where I signed the contract to end my life in triplicate. Admittedly, they brewed great coffee here and brought me lunch for free. As I was finishing filling out the forms, Damien looked over to me, smiling. "Thomas, just want to let you know that Norm from Discreet Investigations just contacted us, and I let him know for you to call him back and confirm that we are now representing you. Thought you might want Norm to follow up with Mr. Johnston as well." I thought for a moment and nodded. "Good idea. And Thomas," he said with a serious expression on his face, but it looked a lot less professional. "Yes. Would you mind having brunch on Sunday morning? I mean, it's not like you want to do much in your usual circle until it's over." I thought about it for a bit, and agreed. I spent the rest of the day at the Knocker and started going through our bills. There was nothing unusual on any of them. However, no longer being the gullible person I had been 24 hours earlier, I set up a couple of alerts in case something happened to the amount above $1,000 a day. That night, I received an email from George asking me to get well soon and hoping I would be back in the office on Monday. Candice called me and lovingly told me how much she missed me. I knew that if none of this was true, then I had a lot to make up for. But what kept me wondering was that Candice had never once said she was considering cancelling the trip and staying to watch over me. I got a call from Norm. He confirmed that he had followed up with all 3 targets, and now all that was left to do was wait. In his experience, if a deceiver had a scheme emerging, he didn't change it unless necessary, otherwise, it was harder to maintain the lie. As a result, he didn't wait for anything until after they left for the conference if they were really going to meet. Finally, I got a text from Jonah asking how I was doing. I replied that I was doing well, but I was nervous to confirm what was really going on. By Saturday afternoon, my worst fears were realized. The conference, if you can call it that, was being held at a hotel a few hours' drive from Melbourne. The 5 of them had rented a room and didn't even bother to close the curtains before beginning their debauched orgy. Norm's 3 investigators met their tails, and each found their own place to watch what was going on. Within an hour, Candice was already being entertained. Sunday morning, just a couple of days after their so-called conference began, I woke up and checked out of the hotel. I wasn't feeling well from what I had been told so far, but I needed to head home to change and head over to Damien's for brunch, as we had agreed. As I entered my apartment, I looked around in dismay. Everywhere I looked, I saw places where Candice and I had made love, but now I also saw each of her other lovers entertaining her in the places they sat when they came to visit us. I threw up again, this time in the bathroom, before I quickly showered and changed. I knew I would never stay in that place again. Candice had defiled my home, whether she entertained them here or not. An hour later, an Uber dropped me off at Damien's penthouse in downtown Melbourne. It was a beautiful apartment, and I met his wife Mel and daughter Colleen. For the next hour, the 3 of them entertained me. I was surprised that there was a sense of sophistication in Colleen, but at the same time, a modesty that I had not expected from the daughter of a shark. After we ate a great brunch of potato hash browns with bacon and spinach and drank another amazing coffee, Colleen bowed out and left Damien, Mel, and me to chat. I looked over at Damien. The man standing in front of me in jeans and a t-shirt was the polar opposite of the take-no-prisoners lawyer I'd met a few days ago. He noticed this and laughed when I told him my thoughts. "Thomas, it's okay," he said, repeating one of my favorite phrases at work. "I have to be that kind of person. I mean, I have my name hanging on the door. But after hearing your story, my invitation was an honest expression of potential friendship. I believe you are a good person who has had a lot of people fall on you from a great height. When I told Mel what was going on, she almost insisted that you come." The pair exchanged quick glances, and Mel nodded. "You see, Mel has been where you are now once before," Damien said. Mel began, "Thomas, I understand what you're going through. Something similar happened to me a few years ago. My first husband, Lawrence, cheated on me with 2 other people," she said, blushing. I saw Damien squeeze her hand. She sighed. "I hope everything is okay," she asked, looking at me. "But Damien only shared a small part of what you're going through," he said. "The reports were graphic." I nodded. "Well, I understand that. When I found my first husband, Lawrence, I found him in our bed with 2 other men." "Oh," I said, wrinkling my nose. She nodded. "I'm so sorry," I said, my mind returning to the images of my wife with 4 other men. I shuddered again. It was soul-destroying. "At the time, I was going crazy," she told me, somewhat confused by old memories. "In a rage, I must have trashed half the house and then kicked all 3 of them out, still screaming hysterically. I ended up going to Damien's law firm to get a divorce, and one of Damien's alumni handled the case." "Is that how you 2 met?" I asked. They both shook their heads. Damien smiled, looking at his wife. "My story is a little different," he told me. "I was engaged, but Cherry, to whom I was engaged, couldn't stand the long and obscure hours I spent as a partner in a law firm, so we broke up. Not the worst breakup, but a breakup nonetheless. About a month before Mel's divorce was finalized, we met at a coffee shop downstairs. I was attracted to her face and her pregnant belly." "You mean?" I asked, looking at Mel, who blushed. They both nodded at me. "Yes, Colleen is Lawrence's daughter," Mel explained. I found out a few weeks after everything happened. It didn't change anything for me, Damien said. I didn't hesitate to adopt Colleen when she turned 2, and Mel and I got married. Lawrence happily signed the adoption papers because it meant he didn't have to pay child support. We sat for a while, letting me digest what was said. I looked at them again, sipping my coffee. So, what happened to Lawrence? I asked. Damien snorted. Over the course of the following year, he became seriously ill with several STDs. We haven't followed up on him in a while, but the last we heard was that he was living in a shared house while working in customer service for a major telecommunications company, he explained. Then, he sighed. But if that makes him happy, then good for him. But he should have been honest with Mel. Mel squeezed his hand again and looked at him lovingly. Yes, but it brought you and me together. I can't complain about that, even if it cost me a little pain, Mel said. There is that, Damien replied, almost guardedly. We talked some more, and Colleen came back and spent some time with us, then went back inside to call her friends on Discord. What about you, Thomas? Asked Mel after bringing each of us fresh coffee. Mel, I learned, made excellent coffee. She had taken a barista course a few years ago, and really knew how to make a cappuccino. I looked at Damien and raised an eyebrow. He smiled, waving his hand dismissively. You're not on the clock, he told me, smiling. It's just new friends, showing concern for someone they want to support. I smiled, which felt like the first, genuine smile I'd had since everything had happened. Honestly, I looked into my coffee as if they were tea leaves that could give me direction for the future. I don't. I suppose Darman told you I'd inherit a lot of money in a few years. Mel shook her head and smiled. No, he just told me that you were in a bad position and a little about your wife cheating on you with a few people. I looked at Damien, and he smiled. The look on his face let me know that I should tell my story. Well, I said, taking a deep breath. Candace and I have been married for a few years now. We talked about starting a family soon, but then one of the interns where I work brought it to my attention that my wife was cheating on me. Turns out it was with my boss, her boss, my former lawyer. Damien smiled, and with a friend of mine. Candace has been going to these conferences for a few years now, so I can only guess it's been going on for as long as that. What I've seen from reports, videos, and photos suggest that, at least, I matched my ex-husband. I blushed slightly at that admission. So I guess the first thing I need to do is get the house in order. They all have to go. For a moment, I saw the expression of a white dog scoping out its prey reappear on Damien's face. He saw that I caught that expression, and this time he blushed. It's okay, Darman. You can enjoy the challenge, I told him. He laughed. I sighed again, shifting my gaze from my coffee to the couple in front of me and then to the balcony to look out over Melbourne. The city was quiet on the weekend, and I felt peaceful. I think the first thing I need to do is get a full report from Norm. Damien nodded in agreement. Then I'll enforce the marriage contract with Candace in full and sue everyone involved. Damien laughed, but Mel frowned. Thomas, she said, leaning forward, I understand that you need to do these things, but what about you personally? You said you had money, so if this group of people betrayed you, your money must have something to do with it. But from what I'm hearing, your situation is much worse than my ex-husband's. You've been betrayed by everyone. I'd been struggling with feelings of inferiority for some time, and from what you've told me, I'm sure things will be much worse for you. She paused for a moment and looked at me, her eyes soft and caring. I'm sorry, it probably hasn't gotten to you yet, she told me. It took me a few weeks, but you're going to need help, support, and a psychiatrist, Mel told me, not holding back. I shrugged. I guess, I said and turned to look at the cityscape again. I'm serious, Thomas, she said. If you'll let me, I'd like Darman and me to be by your side. Damien is a shark at work, I smiled, still looking at the city, but I can tell you that he's very selective about the people we socialize with. The fact that you're here with us this morning shows that my husband thinks a lot of you. I turned around to the couple with surprise written all over my face. Damien blushed slightly and shrugged. I don't make friends easily, he told me, but I like you, and that you're a man of means, know your business, and don't put up with nonsense. He looked at his wife. When you told me your story, I thought about what Mel had been through and decided that we could at least be an umbrella for him. I was touched. I never thought this guy could have a softer side or that a lawyer would care. We spent the next couple of hours having a more candid conversation about my situation. Mel kept mentioning the emotional impact, and by the time I left to check into a new hotel in another part of town, I was feeling much more emotional about what I was going through. But I also realized for the first time that I had support. I talked to Candice for a few minutes when she called later that evening. She spoke to me normally again, as if nothing had happened. When I got the report from Norm, during this time, I was able to time match her phone call with a video of her with Randy. Damien advised me to keep going to the office and act as normal as possible until he had as many legal documents prepared as possible. I tried, but I think everyone realized something was wrong. It was probably late Tuesday morning when Iona came in and sat on my desk. Thomas, you look terrible, she said. So, you found out something happened? She asked, questioningly but quietly, trying not to speak too loudly. I nodded slowly. Judging by your mood, it's a lot worse than we talked about, she said, as if she expected it. I nodded again. I leaned back in my chair, trying not to snap. I'm sorry, Thomas. I really am, she said sympathetically. I'm sorry I'm the one who told you. I'm ashamed. In her German accent, the word ashamed sounded much more mournful than in her Australian accent. I looked at her again. Don't be, I told her, feeling my resolve grow to fight my way out of this situation as I watched her try to understand my pain. If it weren't for you, I'd still be an ignorant cuckold walking toward an unknown future. What's a cuckold? She asked. I found a simple definition on Wikipedia, and saw her eyes widen with shock and then soften with sympathy. Then, in low tones, I gave her a summary of what I had learned, being careful not to describe in too much detail the sordid scenes I had seen without even listening to the whole. By the end of it, tears came to her eyes. It was a good thing I had an office, because if we had been sitting on the main floor, we would have been stared at even more than we were now. I wondered, not for the first time, if anyone here knew that William Zach, the second owner of Son, and Zach knew about the affair. Iona asked if she and I would meet her for dinner that night. Because she wouldn't be able to keep her cool if I invited her to dinner and told her everything. I agreed, and we hit the road a few hours after work. She had 4 days, including today, left before her paid internship ended, so she wanted to leave. Well, I will admit that later that afternoon, our office manager, Mary, looked at me strangely as I passed her in the hallway after lunch. She conferred with William for several hours, and I pretended to work the rest of the day. I looked at both men. I had talked to Damien, who had become my new lawyer and new friend, several times this week. I'd even talked to Mel a couple of times. I quickly began to trust this man. Of course, Damien is part of the inner circle, I told my private investigator. What's going on? What have you heard that makes this worse than what we've seen so far? Norm looked me straight in the face as he uttered the next phrase that nearly knocked me out of the loop in a week of confusion. They're talking about being able to kill you in about 3 years, Damien and I said at the same time. Norm nodded. Not right away, however. Twice now, We've overheard the group talking about taking you out in a couple of years and dividing your trust among the 5 of them. I sat there stunned, then looked at my investigator. How? They don't have a method yet, Norm told us, as if he was breaking the news, but they've been talking about an accident, which they don't like very much. They're leaning toward the possibility that your wife slowly poisoned you by putting something in your food. Stunned was the wrong word, shocked was closer to the truth. The only good news is that they're talking in the future tense. They don't have an actual plan yet, but apparently they talk about it every time. Your friend Roger is apparently a chemist, I nodded my head. And he said he can make a compound that will slowly kill you. I'm sorry, guys, but I couldn't finish. Both men nodded in agreement. Your wife, for her part, seems somewhat reluctant. I certainly believe that she cares for you, but she seems willing to go out of her way to get some of your money directly. But why? I wheezed more than I wanted to. We married, and if the money belonged to me, it would belong to us. Why is she trying to do this? She knows I would never limit it, Norm shrugged. People do stupid things when it comes to money. Look, the main thing is that they haven't done anything yet. I believe they want your wife to have the baby and are waiting until you have full access to the trust to smooth things over. My team is still in place, Norm told us. They are still listening, and frankly, they are as concerned as you are probably feeling right now. All 3 of them sought counseling after this assignment, and they are all seasoned professionals. We discussed a few more details, and Norm pulled out a USB drive for Damien and me with other videos, photos, and audio recordings. Damien told me that next week he would prepare all the necessary paperwork, including the divorce papers, using a copy of the prenuptial agreement. Next week, I will sue Simon and Zach's, Candace's place of employment, and every cheater he even talked to. A real estate agent who wasn't averse to selling the condo believed that once I gave the okay, the condo could be sold very quickly. After their plans to kill me in the future became known, Damien also mentioned that he would talk to the police about a plot to commit murder. He prepared restraining orders for each of them, instructing them to stay as far away from me as possible. Later that evening, I had dinner with Jonah, and told her pretty much everything. She was appalled at the way I was being treated and asked what I was going to do. I tried to keep quiet, but she also knew me well enough to realize that I wouldn't tolerate Candace or the other 4 treating me so badly. The next few days went by as normal, well as normal as is even possible when your life is turned inside out. I worked, ate, seemed asleep, and every night I changed the lodge I was staying at. Now, I was getting a little paranoid that someone might know where I was lying. Norm called me Thursday afternoon and asked me to meet him in the evening. When I arrived, I was surprised to find Damien already there, a grim expression frozen on his face. As the 3 of us sat down at the table and I looked at the 2 men, my heart dropped. Is it really that bad? I asked, trying to be cheerful, but my heart was out of place. Norm nodded. I invited Damien here because it became known that you weren't doing a good job. It got to your boss, and he talked to your wife. Our team managed to get some audio recordings using a special microphone. My heart clenched, thinking back over the last few days. I realized that both William and Mary had been aware of what was going on and talking to George to some degree. If I thought that was the end of it, I was wrong. Norm cleared his throat and brought my attention back to the current moment. I'm sorry, but this is worse than anything you've seen so far, he said. You mean my wife having fun with my boss, her boss, my lawyer, my friend, and at least a few other people at my workplace, and that's worse? I asked, with a note of contempt in my voice. Norm didn't take it personally. He nodded. Unfortunately, he began, but stopped. I invited Damien here today because he is acting as your new attorney. So far, I've only shared snippets with him as he set things up, but given what today's report showed, I think he should be aware of our next steps. In the end, I settled on a plan that would keep them in the dark as long as possible, giving me enough time to get out of the first trouble. True, it meant I'd have to hold out on work for the rest of the week, and after that, however, all hell would break loose, and I would never set foot in that place again. We spent some more time planning, and during our conversation, I even got a call from Candace. I sent the phone to voicemail, saying I'd call her back later to keep up appearances. The next day, we threw a farewell party at work for Iona. She had successfully completed her internship and was looking forward to her next step. Over cake and coffee, she quietly asked how I was feeling, and I shook my head. She asked if we could meet for a drink after work, and I smiled. The rest of the day, I trained hard and managed to get some work done. By the end of the day, I got a few smiles from William and Mary as I turned in my work and seemed to be back on track. That evening, over drinks without revealing details, I told Iona that things were getting worse, and that it was a good thing she wouldn't be working at Simon and Zach's for long. She understood the hidden meaning, and while we were talking, I got a call from Mel. "Hey Thomas, how's it going?" she asked with concern in her voice. On second thought, fine, I told her, while Iona looked at me perplexed as to who I was talking to. "I have a plan, and your husband is frothing at the mouth waiting for it to start." Mel's laughter could be heard on the other end of the line, and Iona looked at me perplexed. "Listen, I was calling about Damien and I planning to go penguin watching tomorrow near Phillip Island, and I was wondering if you wanted to come with us. Before you say no, I want to tell you that you should go because you need to get out in nature and be with friends who can help you get through this." I smiled and then looked at Jonah, who was waiting patiently for me. "Sure, Mel. Do you mind if I bring a friend with me?" I asked. Iona looked at me. I heard Mel laugh. "Sure, what's her name?" You could hear the mirth in her voice. "Iona, she's the one who brought me up to speed." We talked for another minute and agreed on a time and place to meet. When I hung up, Iona continued to look at me questioningly. "Did you just ask me out by proxy, by calling another woman?" she asked. When she said it, I think she saw the panic on my face. Her face changed, and she laughed. "Relax, Thomas," Iona told me, putting her hand on my arm. "I realize you need friends right now. Where are we going, and have I heard the word penguins?" The next morning at 7:30, Jonah and I met Darman, Mel, and Colleen at a gas station outside of town. I was surprised when they showed up in a canary yellow 2019 Mustang. I heard the sound of the big V8 before I even saw it and was impressed, then surprised when it pulled up next to my own 2020 V8 Mach 1 Grey. "I knew I liked you for a reason," I smiled as I greeted Darman.